So I am humbled and honored to be here this morning with this very distinguished panel. And I thank the Imam Nader, Archbishop Angelos, and Grandmother Mona for being here today to share with us a discussion, to share with us in this discussion about religious liberties from their individual faith traditions. So we will begin with the Imam, and we'll go in the same order we did in the prayer service. We're going to follow along. And again, each speaker will offer a short presentation. And the hope today is to leave more time for questions and discussion so that we can have a rich exchange of ideas after presenting each faith tradition's understanding of religious liberty. So, Imam Nader.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to thank all the staff and organization of Notre Dame Law School Religious Liberty Summit for their invitation. I'd like to thank my brothers and sister taking part of the section, His Eminence Archbishop Angelos, Grandmother Mona, and my brother, Father John Paul. My brief comments in this panel will be on the right to religious freedom in Islam, the Marrakesh Declaration. On January 27, 2016, a declaration on the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majorities countries was signed by 250 eminent Islamic scholars gathered in Marrakesh, Morocco, and from over 120 nations, containing an appeal to develop Islamic jurisprudence on the concept of citizenship, inclusive of all religious groups. The event was attended by 50 leaders of other religions and representatives of Islamic and international organizations. The declaration calls on Islamic scholars and intellectuals to develop a new inclusive concept of citizenship in Islamic jurisprudence and appeals to educational institutions for a courageous review of educational programs to eliminate any argument that incites aggression and extremism, leading to war and chaos, and to the politicians to establish a constitutional contract between citizens. The Marrakesh Declaration takes up the Charter of Medina, Sahifat al-Medina, which in that year, 2016, marks the 1,400 years of the conclusion a constitutional contract between the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the people of Medina that guaranteed religious freedom for all, regardless of faith. The goal of Marrakesh Declaration is the development of a concept of citizenship inclusive of different religious and culture groups based on the principles of the Medina Charter, which indiscriminately guarantees the right to religious freedom. The Marrakesh Declaration has as its common purpose the full protection of the rights and freedoms of all religious groups, stating that it's inconceivable to employ religion for the purpose of attacking the rights of religious minorities in Muslim countries. Recognition of religious and cultural diversity is the main feature of the Marrakesh Declaration, which is not a list of prescriptions referring to individual groups, but the acceptance of religious diversity and religious liberty. Today, many Muslim countries accept the religious liberty. In global legal terms, Religious liberty receives its primary definition from Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been incorporated into other international instruments such as the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. Many Muslim majority states have even signed and ratified the ICCPR, which contains the wording of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration with some minor changes. The article reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with other, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." The Marrakesh Declaration represents a step forward for the development of interreligious dialogue and the recognition of the right to religious freedom. Thank you.
Now hear from His Eminence Archbishop Angelos from the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Archbishop in London.
Thank you, I want to thank you, Father. It's a privilege to be here with you and to see the faces of so many friends in the audience, and wonderful to engage, especially that some of us were in London together only a few days ago for a conference on religious freedom and freedom of religion or belief. I am not as qualified as many in this room, so I come with an occupational hazard of being a religious leader, a minister, a pastor, and that is the angle from which we sit on this. And therefore, from that perspective, we look at how God deals with humankind as a mirror of how we must deal with one another. And that is that He, in creation, has given us the concept of dignity and an identity of the whole of humanity. And we must all be able to present that. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 26, we read, "Then God said, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness." Whether we're speaking about the Abrahamic religions, or indeed other religions or processes of belief, there is something to that effect that says that there is a sanctity of life in all. And just as God's love is indiscriminate, we must also endeavor to see that we advocate for all indiscriminately. Not because they are deserving of it, because who are we to determine who deserves what? In the Epistle to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28, we read, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one." And that is what we must have as a spirit of advocates. You see, as a Christian, I believe that my faith is true, and that is undeniable, and that is not even open for discussion. I believe in the triune God. I believe in our Lord Jesus Christ as my Savior. And I believe that there is a life that awaits me, hopefully the life I'm hoping for. But I also believe that God has given us the right to reject Him, as we do in sin every day, or as others do by following their own faith or belief. And as much as I disagree with that, it is not up to me to judge. I don't call others to Christianity because I want to have another brownie point in heaven. I don't want to call others to Christianity just so we can have more Christians than others in the world. I do that because I believe in Him is life. And because I love all of humanity, then I call them to life. But in that same love, I must also respect the choices they make and continue to be a manifestation of the light and the love of God. Of course, we've heard about Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we all declare it, but I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that international treaties and conventions are great, but they are only the encapsulation of initial God-given rights in the first place, in his image and likeness and in human dignity and sanctity of life. We are not reinventing the wheel. We are not telling God what is and is not important. We are trusting and respecting the life and freedom that he has given to all. There's also another undeniable fact. As much as people would want us to believe otherwise, 80% of our world today considers that it is affiliated with some form of religion or belief. It matters. And it matters greatly. And with that, ourselves as members of those religions and or beliefs, and myself as a cleric, as a pastor, it gives us legitimacy and it gives us strength. We're constantly on the back foot. We're thinking religion is now unneeded. It's not true at all. I have been living in the United Kingdom for almost 30 years. But I'm back to Egypt regularly. I'm through the Middle East regularly. And in that part of the world, as well as Africa, North and Sub-Saharan and South, many parts of South America, Central America, in the global South and throughout the world, there are many, many who affiliate themselves with Christianity or with faith or with belief. And so we need to change the narrative. We need to change the expectation from one of hopelessness and conflict to one of effectiveness of the religious voice and one of hope and promise. You see, it's not enough for us to lead only when things are good. It's not about us having legitimacy and having doors open because of who we are as religious leaders, but it is accountability and the use of that authority and that legitimacy for the sake of the whole of humankind. Not just our own, because we often will cause ourselves incredible harm by having a very specific mindset of just looking after our own. In the words of a very dear friend of mine, Lord Tariq Ahmed of Wimbledon, who's the UK Minister for Human Rights, and he is a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He says that the true test of anyone's faith or religion is his ability to protect that of another if it's different. Our Lord Jesus Christ says to us, "What is it to you if you do good to those who do good to you?" We're actually called even to love our enemies. Now that caused me a huge struggle over years of how can I have an enemy as a Christian? Then it dawned on me, it's not my enemy from my perspective. It is those who considered me as their enemy. But it is still up to me to love. It is also up to us to present religious literacy and to make people aware of what it is that we are called to. Many people in government, policymakers, very well-intentioned people in the civic life of our nations want to do good, they just don't understand. We can't blame them. We need to be part of the solution. We need to explain who we are and what we are. We need to take ownership of our texts and make sure they are not abused, make sure they are not misused, make sure that we are not represented in a way that actually goes against who we really are. And so when we see infringements on human rights and civil liberties around the world performed in the name of religion, it is up to me as a Christian to stand against that if it is done in the name of Christ, who categorically and without exception rejects any kind of action of that sort. But I also call my sisters and brothers of other faiths to do the same in their own way. We need to look at the reality that persecution, the taking away of liberties, doesn't happen overnight. We sometimes turn a blind eye, we're sometimes distracted, and we let things happen. We become desensitized. Glass ceilings are just glass ceilings. Exclusions are just exclusions. In actual fact, they are persecution, they are alienation, they are marginalization, they are dehumanization. And that's how we must look at things. It is now time for us to speak with a nuanced dialogue and conversation. I don't need to tell you what Albert Einstein says about doing things over and over in the same way and expecting a different reaction. Yes, that is insanity. And far be it from us doing anything that is insane, we must look to be advocates with a nuanced approach. Just last week, and some of you were there, we had a prayer breakfast hosted jointly by myself and the Bishop of Truro, Bishop Philip Mount Stephen, who is the author of the Truro Review that looked into persecution of Christians around the world. And by us standing together and having other people of faith and belief in the room speaking as well, spoke volumes. So what is the picture we are projecting? And how are we speaking of the rights of others? If we do not speak, sisters and brothers, who will? If we who have a passion, you've come thousands of miles, if we don't speak, who will? The language must change. We can no longer sit in our silos because we are members of a global community with fluid borders that have become even more fluid through social media and social interaction. And so there is no more out there. Whatever is out there is going to be in here in a matter of days or weeks or months or years, if it isn't already. The concept of tolerance must be totally done away with. I do not want to be tolerated. I want to be respected. And as Christians, we all believe that we must carry our cross and carry persecution. And as a Christian, I can make that decision for myself, but I can never accept it for another. I can never accept persecution as a status quo for someone else. And so we must collaborate as Christians across faiths and beliefs, between religion, civil society, and everyone else. Because this problem of persecution and the withdrawal of religious liberty is a problem that is obviously too great for any individual, state, organization, anyone to do on their own. It is too big a challenge and we must face it alone. Nelson Mandela says, to deny people their human right is to challenge their very humanity. And if we are looking at the very humanity that God has given us all, then we must challenge anything that goes against that, to reclaim our legitimacy and to increase our expectations of ourselves and of one another. I'll be 30 seconds. Sisters and brothers, being alive is not a privilege, it is a right. Being tolerated is not to be dignified. And we must change our language and our understanding. There must be a new culture. We must restore the dignity of life for all those, especially those who are deprived of it. There must be a need to feel free, safe, and prosperous. It is no longer just about provision, it's about prosperity. It's not about protection, it's about safety. It's not about survival, it's about dignity. In the scriptures, we're told that we are the light of the world, the light of God in the world. If we are indeed to be the light of God, then we must be infinitely more resourceful, because His light is infinitely more powerful, effective than any darkness, and can and will, if we are faithful and we are conduits of that light, break that darkness. Thank you.
I'm just going to continue in order, so despite the fact that I'm moderating, I'm also going to make a brief intervention. And I thank Archbishop, I thank Imam for their beautiful explanations, more theological in nature. I'm going to take kind of a slightly more historical view of the Catholic Church's own coming to an understanding of what religious liberty actually means. Because if we're honest, in the Catholic intellectual tradition, I think we have to recognize that the Catholic Church has not always been identified with the notion of religious liberty. If we go back to the 5th century in Pope Gelasius, and we read his document Duo Sunt, and we speak about the sources of power, even though Pope Gelasius recognized that there was a separate religious authority and civil authority, the civil authority was always subject to that of the religious, because the religious leadership had a higher responsibility than the civic leadership did, because the religious leadership was always responsible for the salvation of souls, not merely the concerns of safety in roads and commerce. Pope Gelasius's thought of the 5th century then is developed by Boniface VIII at the beginning of the 14th century, in the much more radical vision that all authority flows through not the two swords, but the one. It's in the hands of the Pope, who's in charge of the church, and therefore, in a certain sense, in charge of everything. Now, not exactly the model of contemporary religious liberty, to say the least. But most people, when they look at the question of religious liberty in the history of the Catholic Church, they point to the very important document, Dignitatis Humanae, from the Second Vatican Council. But the movement toward an understanding of religious liberty in the Church, in a genuine sense, was already in motion in the 19th century. Not as a response to the trauma of war or any singular event, but in response to the growth of the nation state and the power of European liberalism in the truest sense. And it's then that the popes begin to react against this understanding of what the famous and controversial American Jesuit John Courtney Murray refers to as the divinization of the state. It's this slow process of divinization of the state that begins in the 19th century, particularly in European liberalism, that the Catholic Church begins to understand that she has to deepen her understanding of the dignity of the human person and what it means to safeguard that dignity of the human person, particularly in regards to religious worship. And so already in 1885, Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Immortale Dei, writes very frankly that all questions that concern religion are to be referred to private judgment. This is 1885. Leo XIII continues, everyone is to be free to follow whatever religion he prefers, or none at all, or disapprove of all. This is a pope in 1885. Just to be clear, this is not 20th century thought. But he's clearly responding to the situation, not only the particular situation of the church in the Italian state, and I'll leave to the Italians a greater discussion of the situation of the church in Italy in 1885, which was less than perfect, let's say. But the Pope continues, he says, the judgment of each one's conscience is independent of law, so that the law of the state cannot impose itself on matters of conscience, on decisions of religion, or even the decision to disapprove of all religion. But if the state can't do it, the Pope says, no one can, which means that even he can't. So the church can't take a position contrary to a matter of individual conscience, which, as Archbishop said so beautifully earlier, comes to us through the gift of being created in the image and likeness of God, regardless of faith. It is that is the source of our dignity. It is that is the source of religious liberty. It is not a right that is given by the state. The Pope says that, again, Pope Leo XIII in 1885 affirms just the contrary. He says, the state, however, is bound to grant equal rights to every creed, so that public order may not be disturbed by any particular form of religious belief. So what is the role of the state in regards to religious liberty? The role of the state is merely to guarantee that the public order is maintained, where religious expression does not touch the order, the public good, which is a concept very prevalent in Catholic thought in the 19th and 20th centuries, which unfortunately the discussion of common good, at least in the Anglophone world, has sort of fallen by the wayside. While there are some esteemed scholars who seek to revive that tradition, thanks be to God, we're not quite where we need to be with the understanding of common good anymore. Another important passage in the Catholic development of the understanding of religious liberty came in the face of fascism in particular. So there are two very famous encyclicals from the 1930s, the very first papal documents to be promulgated in languages other than Latin, because they were pastoral letters to the faithful in Germany and in Italian. And in Mit Brünner der Sorge, in number 8, the Pope writes that whoever exalts race, or the people, or the state, or a particular form of the state, or the depositories of power, or any other fundamental value of the human community, however necessary and honorable their function of worldly things may be, whoever raises these notions above their standard value and divinizes them to an idolatrous level distorts and perverts an order of the world planned and created by God. He is far from true faith in God and from the concept of life which that faith upholds. In this passage, the Pope puts the onus on the believer to purify his or her own thought, to separate the proper role of the state and the proper role of our own faith, and not to confuse the two, which is what the Pope saw happening in National Socialism in the 1930s. So that even men and women of faith came to distort their own understanding of their being created in the image and likeness of God by ceding power over their expression of faith to the state themselves. Not being coerced to do so, but freely giving over their own authority. Mit Brünner der Sorge leads us to sort of the core teachings of Dignitatis Humanae, which within the Catholic world, raised more than one eyebrow, we could say. It's been the source of significant discussion over the past now 60 years. But in number 2, it says very clearly, the Vatican Council declares that the human person has the right to religious freedom, which is probably not the best way to state it, because it's not something that we have a right to. It is something that we have endowed to us by our Creator. It is not a right that is given to us by anyone other than the Creator himself. So we have a right, it would be better stated, for the recognition of the state recognize our understanding of our own creation in the image and likeness of God, and that natural dignity that religious freedom is an expression of. Number 2 in Dignitatis Humanae continues, the Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its very foundation in the dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. In accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, as beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, all men at once should be bound by nature and bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. Here, the passage is, again, very clear. It's not the right, again, it's the Catholic Church coming to an understanding that this right transcends religion itself, transcends any particular expression of religion. Now, obviously, as Archbishop said, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic. I believe in the triune God. I believe that the Son of God died for my sins on the cross, was raised from the dead, and that will one day sit in judgment of my soul, and hopefully will call me to be with him. This is what I believe. But by believing that, I must also believe that others have the right to believe differently. And I must more fundamentally believe that no state, no power of this world has the right to limit that exercise of my right to believe, because I have been created by God with free will and with reason. As a Christian, I would say that free will and reason will lead you to the search for the truth, who is the person of Jesus Christ. But I must also say that free will and reason could lead you to a different conclusion, and that is the same right that I have to hold to my God and Savior Jesus Christ. Dignitatis Humanae says, therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. Again, this fundamental understanding that the right to religious liberty is not given to us by the state, nor can it be limited by the state. There's a long development from Pope Gelasius in Duo Sunt to the teachings of Dignitatis Humanae. And again, to quote John Courtney Murray, he says that pluralism, therefore, to speak about the contemporary world in which, as Archbishop mentioned, there is no outside. Everything is fluid. Everything is in constant cultural exchange. So he says pluralism implies disagreement and dissension within the community. But pluralism also implies that there is a community within which there must be agreement and consensus. It is our individual communities of faith that must be in agreement and consensus, and can be in disagreement with the state or with other communities, but must respect their right to dissent from what we hold to be true. And the state can never insert itself into this right. Thank you. And Grandmother Mona will bring us home one more time, our cleanup batter today. Thank you, Grandmother.
First of all, I'd like to say Gamu, greet each and every one of you this good day, and introduce myself. My name is Mona Palaka. My Habasupai people I come from on my mother's side are the people of the blue-green water, and they are located down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The only way to get there is to hike 8 miles or to ride on horseback, or today you can take a helicopter. And I also come from the Hopi and Tewa Pueblo nations of northern Arizona. And the Hopi people are the people of peace. And in our identity and our names that we call ourselves, it means the people. And so I come from those people. My ancestry are of those people. And my clans on my mother's side, like I said, I come from the water. And on my paternal grandmother's side, I come from the Sun clan. And on my paternal grandfather's side, I come from the Tobacco clan. And those are my identity. And as well as I'm also a member of the Colorado River Indian tribes, who are people who live along the Colorado River in Arizona. And you might have noticed by now that my identity comes from the water. And as a matter of fact, we all come from the water, from our mother's womb. We lived in water and we came into this world. The water came out and we followed it into this world. And we continue to use the water in our everyday life. And so that's I've been told is my foundation of life, and my spiritual connection to life on this earth. And I'm really grateful to be here. I'm also a member of the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, women of throughout the world, Indigenous women who are carriers of our traditions, our culture, our spiritual practices and beliefs, our earth-based medicine. And we are members of this council that have come forward, and what we say is that we come with a mission. Our mission is to promote peace, to preserve and protect our culture, to preserve and protect our earth-based medicines and our spiritual practices and beliefs. And I visited here before. The grandmothers have been here before. We made a visit to the Vatican. And I don't want to offend anyone. But when we came here, our statement was that we came here not like the explorers that arrived on our homelands and planted their flag and claimed our homeland as theirs. We came here as the grandmothers, Indigenous women of the world. We came here, we planted our seeds and our flag and prayers for world peace. That's how I come here today. I come here with that intention. I raise my hand to each and every one of you. I have an open hand. In our Hopi way, the Hopi people are the people of peace. So I was told when you come into a space, someone else's space, you come with an open hand, open heart, open mind, a spirit of peace. I do not come to you with my hand in a fist. I come with an open hand in peace and extend that to each and every one of you, as well as everyone else that I cross paths with while I'm here, a place away from my homeland. And so this is the way that I come to you today. I reside in Tucson, Arizona, on the land and territory of the Tohono Nation. And I'd like to also acknowledge the original people of this place, this land, the ancestors, and acknowledge them as well as the ones that have welcomed us here, as well as the Notre Dame University Law School, the Religious Liberties Initiative. And, you know, I have participated in some other discussions, dialogues about religious liberties, and one that I participated in was some years ago, but it was the 60th anniversary of the UN Universal Declaration for Human Rights. I was part of a delegation of world religious leaders who came together, and we drafted a statement that religion is a human right. As a representative of the Indigenous people, the language that I was sent there to make sure that was included was spiritual practices and beliefs. Because Indigenous people, and as was mentioned in some of the discussions yesterday, there are some people who don't identify with that terminology. And so among Indigenous people, we call it our spiritual practices and beliefs, and that was my mission to participate in this drafting of the statement. And there was debate about it. There were some who didn't feel like that should be included. And some of the discussion yesterday pretty much was along those lines of certain practices and beliefs of various religions about how you use that term, religious freedom, or freedom of religion, which comes down to choice, right? So that was the discussion when I stepped forward and presented the inclusion of spiritual practices and beliefs in this statement as a human right. So it makes me feel really good today to know that we've all come together and we're having this dialogue, this discussion about inclusion. And a part of our history as Indigenous people, we were at at the direction of the papal edicts, the papal bulls, indigenous people throughout the world were not identified or even considered human beings and not having rights. And so as a result of that, many of the laws that we're faced with as indigenous people are basically foreign to us. That concept that is applied to us in the laws that have been brought to us, a foreign concept of law. And we're expected to step into courts of law. We're expected to respond and live by laws that don't necessarily apply to our cultural, spiritual practices and beliefs. And so here today, it was just recently, maybe a little over 20 years, it took over 20 years for the indigenous people to be acknowledged and recognized through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, to be considered and identified as having human rights. So we've come that far. It took over 20 years for it to be presented and go through the whole process of being adopted by the United Nations. And through that, we have been able to include in there our rights to our spiritual practices and beliefs, and to have access to our earth-based medicines, our sacred sites, things like that. But then at the same time, it's up to the nation states to adopt it and to actualize it. So it's, even in the United States, that's also a situation we're faced with. It's a law, it's a procedural law. We have the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act. But when it came to applying it, it had no real substance. And so we have to be engaged in, actually developing the regulations that apply to the laws. And so this is what we're faced with. In what has happened since then, the indigenous people are now faced with being able to preserve and protect our sacred sites, and the decisions about our ability to have access and to protect these sacred sites are being decided in courts of law. And so these are situations that hinder our ability to actually have the freedom of religion or freedom to practice our spiritual beliefs. So these are some of the considerations I think that need to be brought to the table in this discussion. It's when it comes to the religion, in calling this religion, the world's religions, I see that there are religious scholars, there are the spiritual authorities of the religions, and they are, but indigenous people have our scriptures you could find them written in the rocks. You could find them in the plants. You could find them in the waters. That's our spiritual scriptures. It's life. And so I'm grateful to be able to share and talk with you, and I appreciate each and every one of you, your time, your energy, your presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Grandmother Mona. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize also Monica. Thank you for your help in the prayer service earlier. So we have time. Sorry, Francesca, when are we supposed to cut off? 11. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes remaining. So if there are any questions from the floor, or if any of the panelists have questions or would like to offer a question to each other, yes, please.
Thank you. I really appreciated this panel. I'm Brett Scharfs, the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. Father Kimes, I really appreciated your explanation of the progress of the Catholic doctrine of religious freedom and the importance of Dignitatis Humanae. I just wanted to mention there was an important conference at Notre Dame a few years ago that resulted in a very, I think, significant issue of the Notre Dame Law Review on Dignitatis Humanae, and I commend that to everyone. Father Archbishop Angelos, as you were speaking about the Genesis passage of our being created in the image of God, it reminded me of another New Testament story that may not often be recognized as a religious freedom story, but I think it is, and it's very much related to that early Genesis account. When Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees about the lawfulness of paying taxes, we recall that his reaction was to take a coin and ask whose image was inscribed on that coin. And it was Caesar's image. And his response was, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And I think we focus on the first half of that frequently as a justification, a Christian justification for lawfulness, obedience to civil law. But what your invocation of the Genesis account reminds us is to ask ourselves the question, what is it that bears the image of God? And of course it is us. It is our face that bears the image of God. And the right to render unto God that which is God's is, I think, a beautiful expression of the doctrine of religious freedom. Because if we don't have religious freedom, we are unable to render unto God that which is God's. So I just wanted to thank you for those insights and just offer that observation as well.
Oh, please.
Thank you, Professor. And I mean, occupational hazard is I'll break out into a mini sermon. So I'm sorry. Never give a clergyman a microphone. Dangerous thing. But also, that's the core of how we end up loving even our enemy, by seeing the image of God in that person beyond what he or she does. And in that liberty as well, that's how I can say, well, this person deserves to be free because of that image and likeness. So thank you for that connection.
Thank you also from my side. Everything was very, very interesting in your speeches, all of you. And my question is, are we really bound to the language of rights? Because in a sense, we have to rethink even the idea of rights, because it is inevitably connected to the idea of the state. Even if some constitutions says we recognize rights, as the Italians mainly do to the Catholic part of the Constitutional Assembly, but we have problems in disconnected rights and state. This is why sometimes I think that we have to focus more on duties, which are not a paternalist idea. They are the substance of human being, because it means that I am bound to somebody, whereas rights inevitably goes in the direction of opposition, my rights, your rights. So a possessive idea instead of relational ideas. And okay, I would like to have your input on this intuition or this idea, and this gives us also a perspective in rethinking how we speak about our relations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's funny how people use the language of separation of church and state, because it's only done when it's convenient. But then we instrumentalize religious leaders when they can make an impact and potentially pacify people and do different things. So the problem is when we're dealing with policymakers and government bureaucrats is the language of rice. It's what's happening. And the problem is it keeps changing. So in the United States, we're talking about international religious freedom. In the UK, we're now speaking about freedom of religion or belief, because the concept of belief is different to religion. And I do think we are often directed by policy and by government speak. St. Paul talks about being a Jew to the Jew and a Gentile to the Gentiles. So if we need to speak to be understood. But I think you're very right in that we also have an opportunity to change the narrative. We don't always have to work to somebody else's narrative. And that's why if, as religious leaders, if people of religion and faith, we can work together to put pressure to change the narrative, then we can also do that. But the problem is we are often locked into our own silos and not locked into a general understanding of the good of many. Because if we were to work together, then we could bring about the change that you so rightly asked for.
And I would just add briefly, if from a Christian perspective in particular, if we consider this under the same rubric of evangelization, again, we always have to be able to explain the gospel to the hearer. So we have to continue to find the language that is most appropriate to bring about the change that we're seeking. And I think grandmother's intervention in particular reminds us that for certain communities, rights are very important because they were denied them for so long, and their communities risked extinction because of the lack of recognition of them as people, as human beings. So in certain contexts, I think rights language can be very powerful, but from a broader context, can we move away from that so that we're not seeking that oppositional? Because if I have a right, what do I want to do? I want to vindicate it. How do I vindicate my right? How do I hold on to it? Whereas if I have a responsibility, there's a different way of approaching it. But the same question is whether do we call it religious liberty? Do we call it religious freedom? Do we speak of freedom of religion and belief so that we include all peoples of all faith traditions, peoples of faith in general, people who recognize the role of faith in their lives? I think the struggle to find that proper language is one, as long as we work together, as long as we speak to one another, we can continue to improve the language to protect not only their rights, but to also help others be able to exercise their responsibilities. Please.
If I give an example, when the Marrakesh Declaration first came out, I spoke to some of my brothers, Sheikh bin Bayer being one of them, and said, well, actually, it doesn't go far enough, because the Medina model speaks about protectorates. It doesn't speak about citizenship. And by having that conversation, even Sheikh bin Bayer and the Forum for Peace started to move the conversation from the Medina model to a model of inclusive citizenship. Yes. Because we were able to have that conversation. So you're very right. Once we come out of our defensive positions, we're able to say, but hang on, see it from my perspective, yes. It makes a difference.
Anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, sorry.
Which one? Sorry?
Yeah, give it to somebody who I've spoken in the last.
Hi, thank you. Stephen Collis from the University of Texas. Each of you have spoken, I think, and provided a theological basis for why religious freedom is important and valuable. There's a strain of research in the United States, at least, but I would suggest it probably stretches across the globe and through time, suggesting that individuals' politics often inform their religious choices. Sometimes we talk about religion informing people's politics, but there's a strain of research suggesting politics informs religion. And you can see some people, at least I think, allowing their politics to distort their views on religious freedom, even if their own religious traditions might provide a theological basis to support religious freedom. So I guess I'm curious, how do you as religious leaders, or how should religious leaders combat this notion of individuals' politics distorting their own religious views regarding religious freedom and the importance of human dignity, and more importantly, loving our enemies as you discussed it?
I'll give a brief response. Again, I think one of the documents I quoted at Brenda Sorga and its Italian counterpart, which has the best name of any papal document ever in history, "Non abbiamo bisogno." We don't need any of that. It was it's the greatest title of any papal document. We don't need any of that. But it was the Pope responding to just that phenomenon. So as the rise of National Socialism in Germany and Italy in the late 30s and early 40s, when this began, the Pope noticed that it began to affect the way that people were practicing their religion. In a certain, just what you're mentioning, the impact of politics on religion rather than on religion on politics. So the Pope, again, did what he could. He stood up and said, "Hey guys, open your eyes. Look at what's going on. You're following a political model that is denying who you are as a person of faith. What on earth are you doing?" So other than calling each other to responsibility and having the courage to stand up and say we don't need any of that, when we see it in our own faith traditions, as both the Imam and Archbishop said, and as Grandmother Mona's people have experienced, there are times when religion comes to be a force of persecution rather than a force of freedom. And whether it was the suppression of indigenous peoples by European colonists in the Americas, or whether it's the experience of Christians under certain caliphates in the Middle East, or vice versa, whether the experience of Islam under the Byzantine Empire, each of our traditions has experienced where faith has come to limit the rights of others. And as leaders in our faith traditions, we have a responsibility to call our own people to attention so that they never allow that to happen. Again, that we open our eyes and point as men and women of conscience, of freedom, to say that that's not what religion does.
And I think it's also about where I see my strength of my identity is. Sometimes we affiliate ourselves to positions of strength because I feel, well, my religious or doctrinal position doesn't give me power, so I'll affiliate myself to something else. And we underestimate the importance of religion and faith in the world today because we believe the nonsense we hear. And I'm really sorry. I'd like to be more eloquent than nonsense, but it's nonsense. When 80% of the world says it has a religious or faith affiliation, how can we then think that doesn't have strength? And so we tag ourselves to different things. But if we were to use that and the moral and ethical position of what we truly believe to influence, this whole term of speaking truth to power suddenly makes sense, rather than being flipped over and then used against us. And as I said, we're instrumentalized, wheeled out when we can make a difference, and put back on the shelf when we can't because we don't need you at the moment because the world is fine. Actually, religion is a source of trouble rather than solution until it becomes a temporal solution.
We have time for one more question.
Brilliant, thank you. First, on Professor Violini's very important point, I'm more sympathetic to the language of rights, I think, than you are, Professor. But I think it's a very important question that we all need to be wrestling with across the traditions of faith. And there really is excellent work, scholarly work on this, which I would commend to everybody. On the side that is more critical of rights talk, believing that it inherently links us with a kind of radical individualism, with an oppositional stance toward others. The work of Joan Lockwood O'Donovan, the philosopher Joan Lockwood O'Donovan, is very good. And then for the position more sympathetic, but not uncritical about the abuses of rights language, of course, Marianne Glendon's great work, Rights Talk, published in the mid-1990s, but fresh and very relevant to today. Second point goes to you, Father Franz. I am so glad that you quoted from Leo XIII, Immortale Dei, on the defense of religious freedom, because as you know, but perhaps not everyone does, that's a document that is very, very frequently invoked by the critics of Dignitatis Humanae and the developed teaching of the Catholic Church in favor of religious liberty. And as you were speaking, and quoting that passage, what came to my mind is the famous letter of John Henry Newman to the Duke of Norfolk, published I think around 1870, in which Newman says, well, I've never been one of these people who's in favor of bringing religion into after-dinner toasts. But if we do have to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, well, yes, I toast the Pope, but I toast conscience first. And that's often quoted and cited as an example of Newman being a man so far ahead of his time, so far ahead of the church. But I think that quotation from Immortale Dei from Leo XIII shows that Newman is actually not a man way ahead of his time. He is a man of his time in the church of his time that is really concerned about the divinization, or as I whispered into the ear of Professor West, really the re-divinization of the state.
Right. I completely agree, and it's again within the Catholic Church's own history, the struggle for the concept of religious liberty, the opposition, if you will, the opposition party to Dignitatis Humanae is being, Dignitatis Humanae in its very opening line says nothing is changed in the Catholic tradition in faith by this document. So it sets itself up as being in line, and of course critics were very, very harsh against that, and the text that they would most often quote is Immortale Dei. I would argue misunderstanding what Pope Leo XIII was, and this notion, in a certain sense, I think as responsible Catholic thinkers, we have to go back to Leo XIII in particular, whether it's for social doctrine or for the freedom of conscience, all of these things, because these documents were being composed at a time where the state was incredibly aggressive against the church, to the point of confiscating all of its property in Italy, to the point of seeking literally to crush the Catholic Church. And in response, Pope Leo XIII didn't call to arms. He didn't, it was not this. He taught his people. And what he taught his people was for freedom of conscience, the expression of religious liberty, that the only way to combat an aggressive state is to, again, maybe not, whether it's a question of rights or responsibilities, whatever that language is, but the proper way to do that is through the expression of the freedom of conscience by our understanding as our dignity endowed to us by our Creator. So there's rich heritage in Leo XIII's writing that I think could be rediscovered.
Can I just say one quick point, and that is, that also plays to the fact that those who advocate best are those who have suffered injustice, because you can't do it theoretically, because then it doesn't come from an experiential position.
And I think too, the Imam, Archbishop, grandmother, all of these faith traditions have experienced their own oppression in their history. And, the fact that the four of us can sit here from four different faith traditions of belief in one panel and united express our concern and our need to work for the ability of people of all faith to be able to live and express that faith. I think this shows the importance of the dialogue, the importance of not only this event, but of the initiative, and the importance of continuing the dialogue and continuing to work together, understanding our common relationship as brothers and sisters in, as Archbishop reminds us, a struggle that is more perceived than real, perhaps, but one that we can't ignore. As long as 80% of us still claim to be of a faith tradition, we have strength in numbers, but that strength in numbers requires voice. So thank you all for your participation. I thank the panelists for giving their voice to this great cause. Thank you.